Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be answering some of your questions that you had about my experience on the JET program. If you didn't already know, I lived in Japan for a year and taught English at a high school in Kobe. If you want to hear more about that experience, I have a whole video about it from when I was living there. I'll leave a link to it down below along with the why I left the JET program video. On both of those, I've been getting tons of questions from you all, and I figured I would use this opportunity to sit down and just film and answer all of your questions. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the first question is, did you have experience with teaching before you applied? No, I had absolutely no teaching experience. I got a 4-year bachelor's degree in marketing, so I didn't have any experience teaching, and it's not a requirement for the application either. The next question is, do you have any tips for the application? I would definitely recommend getting like at least 2 to 3, even maybe 4 people to proofread and review or revise your statement of purpose. I went to my business writing professor, one of my friends who was an editor, and another one of my friends who was studying like English and writing and literature and stuff. And I felt like that made my statement of purpose really strong. So definitely get some people to review that for you. Don't just write it out and kind of submit as is, because that is a huge part of the application. What was your Japanese proficiency like before you got to Japan? So I would say I was like beginner to intermediate level. So I could introduce myself, talk about where I came from, what my hobbies are, and hold a pretty casual conversation with someone. And when I was listening to people at my school talking, I could understand about like 60 to 70% of what was being said. And that extra 30% is really important. It can sometimes make or break a conversation. But one of my colleagues actually told me that I sounded like her 7-year-old son when I talked. So I would say I was at about like a 7 or 8-year-old level of speaking Japanese. I could definitely get by though. What was it like connecting with friends? I was very lucky to be placed in Hyogo Prefecture, which is where Kobe is located. Hyogo Prefecture had tons of ALTs, and there was a lot of cool like opportunities to go and build relationships with the other ALTs. I remember there was like one of the more tenured ALTs who had been there for like 4 years took a bunch of us on a walking tour of Kobe City and showed us some fun things to do and useful places to go. So whenever I would participate in things like that, I would meet people and make friends. Also in the beginning, you go through a lot of orientation, so you're spending a lot of time with the same people. How helpful was the orientation in planning lessons? You mentioned briefly about this in the other video. So the orientation was really helpful at showing you example lessons and giving you actual hard material to take back with you and create your own ideas from. I remember we were given a lot of like physical papers with lesson ideas, and then in orientation we would run through what a typical lesson would look like. To be honest though, it wasn't that helpful for me because the school that I was teaching at, the English level was so low that even the lowest level English example lessons that we were given in the orientation still was too hard for a lot of my students. So in some ways it was helpful, but I would say on a scale from like 1 to 10, it was probably like a 4 or 5. It wasn't like super helpful. Can you tell us how you would pay my US student loans from Japan? And will I have access to my student loan website from Japan? Yes, I did. Right away when I got to Japan, I started paying for a VPN. It basically made it seem like my computer was in the US and I could access all the same US websites. So I was definitely able to access that. Without the VPN, I don't know if I would have been able to. I think I could, because on my work computer, sometimes I would log on when I was at work and they give you a laptop to use. So you'll definitely have access to the website. The way that I paid my student loans was I actually had money saved up in my US bank account before I moved to Japan. So I was paying those through the internet, and I just had my student loan website connected to my bank account, and then I would just make the deposit that way. All right, how did you deal with the high expectations they had for you when the program told you you would only have to be an assistant? I honestly don't think I could bear that kind of responsibility, taking on the majority of the lesson planning and running the classes. How do you do it? Honestly, what got me through it is that I didn't really feel like I had a choice. So I didn't really have a choice to like not do the amount of work that was given to me in the beginning. I just kind of accepted that, okay, this is my situation. They told us over and over and over again in orientation, like every situation is different. So I just kind of accepted that this is my situation and I'm gonna have to live with this. It was a lot of work, and like I said in my last video, at one point I actually had to ask the teachers like, hey, I can't handle all of this on my own. And then they decreased the number of classes that I had, but that wasn't until like 4 or 5 months into working on the job. So dealing with the high expectations, I just tried to live up to it the best that I could. I was super stressed out, and I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to go about it. Maybe I should have had that conversation earlier on, and I encourage you to if you feel like your workload is too much. But yeah, I mean, I think it gets to a point where if you can't do it, you just really need to speak up and have your voice be heard by the school, and hopefully they can help you. Okay, the next question is, I was just wondering where you lived and maybe what school you worked at. I don't know if you're able to disclose which school you were at, but no problem if not. Would you recommend where you lived, or is there somewhere else you went that you thought would have been better? I lived in Kobe, which is a city in Hyogo Prefecture, and the high school was the Kobe Commercial High School. That's where I worked. Would I recommend where I lived? Yeah, I really liked where I lived. It was, about a 15-minute walk from the train station, so I could get places pretty easily. There were a lot of buses near my house. Everything was super walkable, like literally right across the street from my apartment building was the supermarket. And I actually walked to work as well. So the school that I worked at was only an 8-minute walk from my apartment, which was really nice, especially on like rainy days. It didn't take that long to get to and from school. So I really liked where I lived. I actually loved it. In fact, from my apartment building, I could see the ocean too, the Osaka Bay. I didn't choose that location though. Like when you apply for the JET program, you're given a location based on your application. So it's unfortunately not something you can choose, but I would definitely say put down Hyogo or Kobe if you can as a preference, because there's just so much going on there, and it's definitely like a less touristy place than maybe like a Tokyo or Osaka or something. Did you want to teach high school, or was it decided for you? It was decided for me, but on the application I put that I wanted to teach high school, and then also at my interview I told them, they asked me, do you want to teach elementary school, junior high, or middle school, or high school? And I said that my preference was high school students. So I think that factored into me being placed at a high school, but I don't think it's not something that you can actually choose. It sounds really tough that you had to deal with that kind of workload, which seemed to be above what you had expected. Did anyone else you know end up in this situation? Do you think if you hadn't had that extreme workload, you would have enjoyed the experience more? So no, I don't know anybody else who had as much work as me. And I expressed that in my other videos. So I had some friends who had the same amount of classes, but they had 2 ALTs at their school. Or they had the same amount of classes, but they only led maybe 1 or 2 of those, where I was teaching 17 classes a week and leading 17 classes a week. So I didn't know anybody else who did that. I'm sure there were other people in my situation. I just didn't know them personally. And to be honest, I do think I would have enjoyed living in Japan more if the job wasn't so intense. The stress of going to school every day and making those lessons was definitely not something that excited me and was a really big factor in why I left. I don't think necessarily if I would have been at a school with less classes, I don't think I would have enjoyed it anymore though, because the teaching aspect and working with students who have such a low level of English was just really, really tough. If I worked at a school where I had that much work to do, but maybe the English level was higher, maybe then I would have enjoyed it, but it was just really, really tough being with such a low English level. Can you tell us about your apartment and cost of living and expenses? So my apartment, I also have a video on my channel of an apartment tour from back when I lived in Japan. So feel free to check that out. I'll leave a little card for it up here. So I paid monthly rent. I paid in US dollars, it was like $136 or something a month for rent, which just blows my mind. But it was subsidized by the Board of Education for Hyogo. So without being subsidized, I think it would have been like $400 a month, which is still really cheap. So I only had to pay like $100 a month for rent, which was amazing. I just used my paycheck for that. For other living expenses that I had at my apartment, I paid the water bill and the electric bill. The water bill was always the same. I think it was only like $20 or $30, and that came every 2 months. It was very, very inexpensive. And then the electric was more. I always used my aircon and the heater, which is like the same unit. It goes in the top of your apartment. And I would always use that. Like in the summer, I had a timer set so that when I got back from school, it had already been running for an hour and had cooled down the apartment. And then I did the same thing in the winters. That bill could get as high as like $80 a month on an expensive month, and on a less expensive month, I would say it was like maybe 40 or 50 a month. In your first video, you talked about how you wished you prepared more in August. How would you recommend someone to prepare before stepping into school? I don't have a teaching background and I'm pretty nervous about going in blind. Going into the school year with a better sense of what I was gonna teach like week after week after week. So maybe the first week you start with intros and then you do like a food lesson, a travel lesson. Having a better sense of that, like almost a year-long curriculum, I think would have helped me a lot. Because when I went in, I was just kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna do my self-intro and then do something based on the textbook. And if a teacher is having you use a textbook, then unfortunately you kind of have to stick to that. But if it's just a free-for-all, like you can teach whatever you want, I would say try to come up with some sort of long-term curriculum, like I said, where you have maybe their self-intros, maybe a family lesson, a food lesson, travel, and stuff like that, so that you know and you kind of feel comfortable, like, okay, I know what I'm doing, I just have to figure out how I'm gonna do it. Is there an expectation from the JET program to do multiple years? No. That's the reason that they have you decide if you wanna recontract after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years, and some people get the opportunity to stay for 4 or 5 years. So there is no expectation. It is totally up to you. You don't have to stay if you don't want to stay, and you can stay as long as you want unless you get fired for something. But I do think they prefer to have people who are going to be more committed and stay for more than a year. How much Japanese have you retained over the years? I've retained a decent amount, and I think part of that is because I still watch a lot of Japanese shows like Terrace House. I watch some anime here and there. And then I also went back to Japan in January of 2020. So just earlier this year, I went back to Japan and practiced using it. I had some conversations with people in Japanese and would listen to Japanese and help translate things for my boyfriend who I went with. So I've retained some, but if I had to take like a Japanese test or something, or kanji especially, I have not retained kanji well at all. And then the last question I got is, how did you decide that you wanted to go to Kobe? Like I said, from the application, you don't really get to decide where you want to live, but you do get to put your top 3 preferences. So I believe I put Tokyo, Hyogo, and I don't even know what I put as my 3rd one. And I'll tell you something else about why I think I got placed there, was because in my application, I really focused on the fact that I had studied business in university, and that bringing that sort of international business lens to Japan was like an asset, and that it's really important for anybody who wants to get a job internationally in our growing global economy. Learning English is going to be really important for that. So I really emphasized that in my statement of purpose about why I wanted to do the JET program, which is why I think I got placed at Kobe Commercial High School. It's a high school that's focused on commerce, like accounting and all that kind of stuff. So that may have something to do with it. Okay, everyone. Well, I know this was a pretty long video. Thank you for those of you who stuck around till the end. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any more questions, as always, please feel free to leave those down below and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.